All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm just looking to see if it's here. Okay. My name is Amy Lynch, and I am thrilled to be joined today by Susan Brotherton, Elisa Garnage, and Russ, and to be supported in the background by our amazing trauma-informed work group, which goes across the Temple community and variety of disciplines, and explicit help from Jeff Garris and Krista Schroeder to put this presentation together. So we welcome you all here today to join us in this series. We have, as a work group, been trying to do one seminar a semester, and this year we were aiming to focus on trauma and trust. And in the fall, we had an individual level considerations for how trauma disrupts trust. And today we aim to bring you information about trust at trauma and trust at an organizational level. I want to thank David Sarwar, who is always kind enough to offer us this seminar slot every semester. So it's important to all of us presenting here that we have a land acknowledgement. This land acknowledgement actually comes from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which are neighbors down the street here from Temple University. And it is with gratitude and humility that we recognize that we are part of the Lenape-Hokink, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples, a long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, fraudulent agreements such as the Walking Purchase of 1737 displaced many of the Lenape of this land. We strive to understand our place in the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to the Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, the Delaware Tribe, the Delaware Nation, the Stockbridge Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to the Lenape ancestors, past, and present, by committing to building a more inclusive and equitable space for us all to have a relationship and residing together. When we think about trauma and we think about trauma-informed care, just remembering that trauma situations evolve. And so the evolution of our very nation was grounded in as experiences of trauma for the native humans on our land. So we're going to be talking about trauma, and so we always like to give predictions and disclosures. We're going to be talking about things today that you may experience personally or as a work group as intense and strong. You might have strong emotions. You might have visceral reactions. You may have very strong thought patterns shifting or flying around. This is all normal when it comes to talking about trauma. We have individual and group and organizational level responses, and we need to acknowledge those responses because it means in tune we also need to have good self-care. Promise yourself after this session today that you will take time not only to reflect on anything you may have learned or gained or talked about here, but also to honor yourself for that hard work and for some restoration and recovery, going for a walk outside or listening to some good music. And then the other part with predictions and disclosures is anytime we're talking in this space, there's a tendency for folks to consider or think about a single story. And there is no one single story for any situation when it comes to trauma. And so please know that even as we share and tell stories as part of our process, that we are merely reflecting particular situations and that every individual's perception of an experience is their own truth, and that there is no single story any one of us can apply to anyone else with respect to their experiences and their effects of trauma. So our learning objectives for today, we hope at the end of this, you will be able to describe trauma at individual, group, systems, and organizational tiers, and explain how organizations shape around the temporal and historical influences to evolve into systems which cause trauma. To be able to articulate the process of organizational betrayal, trust, and reconciling losses and letting go so that we can move ahead. And identifying, the final one is to be able to identify the application of SAMHSA trauma-informed principles and a model for intervention and approach. As you can imagine, this is a very big topic and a very hot topic. We live in a city that is struggling with the effects of trauma, intergenerational trauma, violence, and trying to figure out as a city, as a university, what do we do? How do we respond? This is not just individual. And so one way in which to start situating new thinking and considering how we can move forward is to situate ourselves within a story. And we purposefully chose a story that was not anything of the news, the big things, because we also needed to choose a story that could be relatable, and not dysregulating. We purposefully chose not to tackle some of the bigger dilemmas that our city and university are facing as a function of the story. The purpose of the storyteller is not to tell you how to think, but to give you questions to think upon. And we wanted to just call out Dr. Megan Corrado, who actually has a whole protocol called Stories, where they use stories to help guide healing. So we're going to use a story today to help guide us into our discussion. And Ann Russ is going to take over with the story.
Thank you. So for our story, we want to center it around this family. We have John, who is pictured on the screen. He's currently in the hospital receiving care post-cardiac arrest. And his family members that are there for him often are his daughter, Mary, and then his granddaughter, Dakota. So they're usually there to see him every day. We also have to think about who takes care of John. And for our story today, our big players are Lottie, who is his patient care technician, and she's doing a lot of care and interaction with John. We also see Darius, who's the social worker on the floor that day. He's John's case manager. And then our third person is Yvette, who is there as a nursing supervisor. So our story starts with John being served dinner. Lottie comes in and gives him his tray and says, let me know if you need anything else. And John looks forward to eating and shares that his family's going to be coming by to visit soon. And Dakota walks in shortly after that, and she has come from soccer practice. She tells her grandfather that she is starving, and John says, go ahead and take my dinner. I'll just go ahead and ask Lottie to send a second tray over. And Dakota starts to eat. John calls Lottie and asks for a second meal. Lottie asks why. She says the meal meets his dietary guidelines. John explains that his granddaughter was hungry. His daughter isn't there yet to get food for Dakota, so he went ahead and gave her his meal. Lottie responds that she can't because it's hospital policy to only provide one tray per patient. Mary arrives and she hears Lottie say she can't get John more food. Mary demands that John is brought a tray, not knowing that he gave his food to Dakota. Lottie, who's nearing the end of her shift, raises her voice and reiterates that only one meal is allowed per patient. Dakota senses the tension and she tries to explain to her mother that it was her fault, and then she begins to rearrange things on the windowsill. John tries to interject, but he quiets as voices continue to rise around him. Darius and Yvette both hear the commotion and head to the room. Darius asks what's going on, and Lottie says that John and his family are being disruptive. Yvette calls for security. Darius disagrees with Yvette's response and calls his supervisor to see if there's a way to get food for John. We're going to keep coming back to this story of these people as we move through the process of looking at trauma and then building trust across individuals, groups, and organizations.
So when we start to talk about trauma and this story, I think we need to really remember the interactive nature of the individual, the groups, and the organization. There's a great quote by Sandy Bloom and Brian Farragher that reads that our systems of care and all the organizations that are part of those systems are alive, functioning as interconnected living systems, therefore subject to the stresses and strains and trauma of actually being alive. So we need to remember that organizations like systems can be fundamentally and unintentionally organized around the impact of chronic stress. So we'll be taking a look at the stresses experienced by the individuals within the small groups, and how leadership will start to step in and how we can address the needs of each of those.
Before we do, we want to just take a moment to step back and to remind ourselves of what the trauma response is. So when we think about trauma as a definition, it's an experience, an event that is experienced as horrific. It's an event that's experienced as a loss of sense of control. It's an event that can be experienced as frightening, worrisome, making one extremely sad and feeling unsafe. And as a function of that, every event can be experienced differently by every single person. And when we look in the trauma world, we tend to think about some traditional responses that we see that are named and framed as fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fib, with a little asterisk next to fib, because fib it's not really a conscious act of lying. It's an expression of a perception of reality that often is misunderstood by other people, but it's often labeled as lying. But that in itself can be traumatizing. So when we're thinking about this landscape, and we're thinking about across an organization, what we want everybody to start thinking about is, well, in this case, this is an event of a family situation regarding meals and regarding access to food and staff and family interactions, that the event is going to be experienced differently from all of the players. And the event might be experienced as fight or flight by one individual, and it might be experienced, and a response as a group might be for the entire group to freeze and do nothing. And so we're going to move through this, thinking about this traditional aspects of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fib at an individual level, a family or group systems level, a community systems or leadership level, and then the whole healthcare system or organization at large. One of the considerations we have to keep in mind throughout this whole discussion is that there is a high degree of variability. At an individual, small group, or organizational level, a system may be functioning as hyper-aroused. It's always on. We are always in fight. We are always in flight. Or it might be hypo-aroused. We are always shut down. We are always fawning, and then in doing so, we are dismissing or avoiding, which is a different way of shutting down. Okay? Or it could be fluctuating, that individuals or groups are going to act in unpredictable ways, that sometimes there's regulation and control and engagement, and we can work this out, and other times we are here to fight, and other times we are afraid and we are leaving. And this variability and determining who is where in the spectrum of responses to the trauma or to the event that's happened can really cause a lot of dilemma in figuring out, how do we respond? Because if we're responding to somebody or an individual or a group or an organization that is constantly on hyper aroused, we're going to have reactive, quick, unhealthy decision making that's not going to land us where we want to be in the days and weeks and months ahead. But if we can't get a handle on a system or an individual or a small group that's fluctuating because we can't quite, well, what are they going to be today? Are they going to be coming out of place from a fight or flight? Or are they going to be fawning and trying to appease us? It becomes very hard. And from a leadership perspective, it becomes very hard to figure out, how do we regulate everybody and help everybody feel safe? There becomes a degree of what's predictable, what's not predictable amongst this climate too. And if you're hyper aroused, always on, and that's always predictable, well, then we can start to shape and name and frame, well, what can we do about that? But if there's unpredictability in the fluctuating, it becomes harder to name and frame. And what's really important with all of this is that at an individual level, somebody could be responding in any of these, but it's going to be interconnected, right? So for the individual family members, one person versus another person, and then how does when one person is in fight and another person is in fawn, how does that shake out in daily living? In a work group, if you have some people who tend to freeze or avoid, or they tend to give a perception of the reality in order to dismiss the actual difficulties and discomfort, how does a whole group work? And how about if different groups have to work together on a unit? And the challenge with this then becomes often not of how's everybody feeling, but it turns into a battleground of who's right. And it's not a matter of who's right. It's a matter of everybody's perception as their truth. And how do we navigate through what each individual, each small group, each organizational perception and truth, how do we navigate through all that to find common grounds?
So let's go ahead and take a look at what has happened to the individuals that are in this story. As said earlier by Amy, we don't want to look at people as just having a single story. So we want to dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on. And we find out that Jackie, who is John's wife and Mary's mom, she passed away from COVID in April 2020. It was one of those things where the hospital staff are holding up a phone so they can say their goodbyes. And that left its mark on the family. Mary has a lot of distrust of being in the hospital. She's worried about what's going to happen to her father. We also find out that John experienced food insecurity, and he's been in situations before where he's been hungry, and his mission is that his family is never going to experience that. He always wants to make sure his family members have food available. He keeps extra food in his cabinets. He's always willing to share with everybody. And so that just felt natural to give his meal to Dakota when she came in and said she was hungry. But we don't want to look only at the family. We want to consider the people who are there to provide care. We look a little bit closer at Lottie, and she has kids to take care of, and she's been reprimanded by her supervisors for showing up late to work. She also has been told that it's a policy right now that if the hospital continues to operate off budget, like giving additional meals to patients, they're taking a crack down at that, and she could be at risk of losing her job for violating policy. Yvette, who's there as a nurse, she feels a need to protect her staff. They've gone through a lot since COVID. There's been a lot of turnover, and she wants to honor and take care of the people who are there. She also has one of the staff nurses out on leave after an injury that nurse sustained during an exchange with a patient who became aggressive. Then we see Darius. He's there as a social worker. He's got a lot on his plate being a social worker, and he's looking for other employment opportunities outside of the hospital and in the private sector. He feels torn between what he should do for John and other patients as a social worker with his mental health knowledge, going up against what the hospital policy and procedures are. But also weighing heavily on him is that he is trying to figure out what's the best financial decision for he and his husband, because they're trying to save money to buy a home.
So now that we have some additional background information about the individuals in the story, besides just the event that we covered at the beginning, we want to step back and talk about the individual levels of the various levels of trauma that we saw in the circle prior. And so we'll start with the individual level. And on the left here, we see event, experience, and effect, the 3 E's of trauma. So we have, based on lots of definitions, but specifically on the SAMHSA definition of trauma, it is a result from an event, series of events or set of circumstances, which we could categorize as an event on the left. And it's experienced as physically threatening, emotionally harmful, life-threatening, and it's going to have an adverse, lasting effect on the individual and their functioning. And so remembering the second E of experience, that a trauma is very individualized in terms of how someone is experiencing an event. The same event could be experienced as traumatic to one person, and the same person who experienced the same event standing next to that other person, it may not be experienced as a trauma to that person. And so just keeping in mind the subjectivity of trauma. And that goes into why, we're not comparing individuals on the same event. We're trying to take a perspective or see their perspective. And as a lot is this question between a shifting of what's wrong with you, kind of from prior to the boom in trauma research, and moving forward with an understanding of trauma and continued research in the area. We're now moving to a trauma-informed thinking of what happened to you. And so to delve a little bit deeper from now that we've thought about what is the definition of trauma on the individual level, looking at the individuals in our story and the responses they're having. So Amy talked about the various types of the common responses to trauma that we see. And so talking specifically about our key players in the story, individuals, we have John, who's the patient, and we could see that John kind of went into a freeze response. He, as soon as Mary came in and the daughter kind of stopped speaking, became quiet. We then also saw Dakota, who eventually is, saying, it was my fault. I took the meal. So she was having a fawning response in that scenario. Mary, the daughter, we understood from the history that Mary, she, experienced the loss of her mother in the healthcare system, during COVID. And so is feeling that, that distrust, and responds in more of a fight response with, raising her voice and, what some of the staff may have seen as a commotion. We then have Lottie, the patient care technician, who has is going into that fight response as well, calling security. Darius, the social worker, is really trying to take a trauma-informed response by, seeing if there's something they could do to get to serve the need of the patient to get an extra meal, but also weighing all of these various competing policies and the situation at hand. And then we have Yvette, the nurse manager, who, we're seeing that fight response as well, in coming from more of a maybe protective capacity because of the history of wanting to protect her staff and calling security.
Let's go ahead and take a minute to think about the historical landscape at the group level. And we can look at a few different small groups in this scenario. We can start with John's family. What we see is that there's this intergenerational trauma that's existent. You know, there's John's trauma of experiencing food insecurity, and that's, you know, relayed into how his daughter and granddaughter have been brought up. So that affects attitudes, values, and beliefs. We see that there's some distrust in the healthcare system because of their experience with John's wife and Mary's mother and Dakota's grandmother. So we have to consider that. We also want to look at the different pools of the hospital staff that were present. Lottie being the patient care technician, her team, they feel like they are not recognized by the hospital system. And so their union's talking about striking to get better wages. We've got Yvette, who's there representing nursing. And again, as Lisa said, she's there trying to protect her staff. They've had a lot of turnover. She's trying to make sure that they're all being represented in this leadership transition as well. We've got Darius with social work and his social work group. A lot of them are overwhelmed with their caseload. They've got a lot of people that they're trying to do the best by. They also have to interact with a lot of complex systems, and those complex systems could have competing interests and competing values. And it's, you know, the question of which one am I loyal to, or which one do I need to abide by in this interaction.
Thank you, Anne. And when we think about each of these groups and what they are experiencing, and even if we just start backwards with the social work group, having to be in a variety of diverse, of wide, complex settings where there's competing demands on them at an individual and a group level. How do we serve all of these clients and these units over here that have different physical, emotional, case management demands that are taxing on me as an individual? And then how do we go over here and serve them over here? And how do we as a group best support the organization in terms of mental health and case management, while also being a profession that's underrepresented in terms of value and pay scales and things like that. And the nursing dealing with what they're dealing with in terms of when you have a change in leadership, there is a shift in trust, relatability. There can be an underlying shift in the whole regulation and tone of a staffing unit of people when there's a leadership change. What happened with the old leadership? What's happening with the new leadership? That can just be an underlying hum of dysregulation in that work group. And then, you know, so that idea that that each group is experiencing collectively something that's different from other groups are experiencing collectively is something we need to consider, because there's an interactional nature amongst these groups, within the groups, across the groups. And so when we think about trauma at a small group level, it's where there's an interactional nature of a situation where more than one individual experiences a sense of horror, fear, out of control, helplessness, feeling really stuck. And so we have these groups that are each approaching situations, events, policies, procedures that can change or shift if they're acting from a fight, a flight, a freeze. You know, in our scenario, we have the small groups of the family, where the family is operating under this premise of distrust and fear and anger. And they're reacting as a unit from that space, even though within it, there are individuals who are doing things slightly different at an individualistic level. When they come together as a group, that's what is happening. The staff, whether it's the nursing group or the social work group or the PSA group, there is a common theme of feeling unseen, unheard, unvalued, exhausted. There's no time to reflect. with these groups and what's been happening. It's been a fast moving train. And so when there's no time to reflect, and we are operating from a space of fight, flight, or freeze, what ends up happening is we're reacting, we're not reflecting. And as a group, we can end up within the group having dilemmas like splitting of staff around different, how should we do? What should we do? You know, and then, you know, from a leadership perspective, leadership is another group. They need to balance the complex demands related to the financial aspects of running the whole organization, the liability and the risks within the organization. Even, you know, gosh, from an infection control perspective, giving food to Dakota that came from the hospital intended for a patient, right? There's that liability and risk, even just right there, let alone the budgetary piece. If every family is giving and sharing their trays now, healthcare organizations aren't where they were with respect to budgets from before COVID. Everybody's operating from behind. And so there's that liability risk financially, or liability, infection, financial risk. And then also leadership is balancing satisfaction of staff, satisfaction of patients, and they, as a collective group, often leadership is seen as adversaries, not allies. We're not saying this is okay. We're saying that this is a part of the historical climate that we need to consider. And that, you know, oftentimes there's a feeling of frustration by different groups of staff who are not feeling the same way or not understanding the actions or the reactions of leadership. And within these groups, we see that aspect of variability in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fib that can be ultimately very destructive. And then notice too that these work groups aren't crossing over yet, because when there starts to be an intermingling of the groups, the small groups, then we get an added layer of dilemma in reaction and responses.
Since we've looked at the small group a little bit more, we'll take another zoom out and we'll look at the historical landscape of the organization. This hospital is in a period of dealing with figuring out what comes next as we've moved and continue to move through COVID. The hospital's under great financial strain. There's inflation, the cost of food is going up for the food they're supplying. Maybe they have more expenses when it comes to vehicles. So we're seeing a lot more expenses going out. Staffing is also an issue. There's a lot of turnover. People are looking for new jobs, or maybe they realize that their job isn't worth some of the stresses that they're going through. So it's hard to bring people in. It's hard to keep people on. And another concern is patient satisfaction. So if we're seeing these financial cuts and financial tightening of the purse strings, and there's different staff turnover, that could trickle down to the patient, and patient satisfaction metrics are really important for healthcare systems and hospitals. And so they might be in a situation where they're scrambling what to do because maybe their patient satisfaction numbers have gone down in the past couple of years. In response to some of the stress and strain, it is natural that there's going to be policy changes, and this hospital has decided to create tighter safety protocol policies. They're doing that to protect their staff. And so maybe that call for security is what Yvette's been trained to do. We also see a restructure due to budget cuts. People don't get continuing education that they used to. And so all the staff had their continuing education units cut in half, and they could be angry about that and not feeling valued. That meal service policy has been another decision, that they only can give people one tray of food. It doesn't matter if they're eating it or a family member's eating it, but there's only one tray of food going in because the cost of eggs are so high, you know? So this is what we're seeing at that hospital level.
So as we said in the beginning, organizations really are like alive, functioning systems. And like any systems in nature, systems really can self-organize themselves around this group experience, and in many ways can organize themselves around the trauma that these groups and individuals have experienced. Policies are designed to serve administration. If we look at the policy of the meals, like Anne had just mentioned again, and we were looking at budgets and how to be fiscally responsible, but then what about the individual? So we have folks that are frustrated with the system, they respond in certain ways, and then the whole system organizes around them. Systems are vulnerable to the impact of this kind of repetitive or chronic stress, and vulnerable to the traumatic experiences that occur within institutions and occur to institutions. If we look, been thinking a lot about COVID, as we've mentioned here already, that there were staff that were really kind of fighting the fight in the emergency room and the first responders. And then there were folks that were able to work from home. So how does an organization deal with that? So let's look at each one of these areas within the organization. The organization is dedicated to meeting the needs of the client, but sometimes absolutely struggles to hear exactly what clients and families are needing. Leadership steps in to try to meet the organization's needs, but also continues to struggle. I think we covered a lot of this in the last slide. Yeah. So what we're really looking at then is at this whole disruption of trust. How do individuals trust those that are trying to care for them? How do some of these teams actually function in a way that they can meet the needs of the clients? How can leadership really be responsible for establishing an overall organization that can support everyone? So here for the audience, what would it feel like to absolutely trust the organization? So what we'd like you to do, and when we count down 3, 2, 1, is to share your ideas through the chat, and we can process through these a bit. What would it feel like to trust an organization? So if we're ready, 3, 2, 1, share. Okay. If you could trust, you would be able to share. You would feel safe. You would feel safe and valued. I love that. Cultural humility. And it would be life-changing, wouldn't it, if you could really trust an organization? Transparency, absolutely key in understanding and working in organizations, not to have to second guess, to know what's expected of you, to feel safe and heard, to have folks available to you, absolutely not being racially profiled. There's spaces for everybody. To be seen as a person, yep, and respected as a person. Having no penalty for taking a mental health day, absolutely. To be able to trust that you can use the time that you're offered by your organization, to know what to expect, to have consistency within your organization, to know what's expected of you. Not being ostracized, and to be able to have your needs taken care of, to be able to express your needs, to be able to offer help to others. Acknowledging the current events that are impacting the community. Absolutely, as we looked at all of those factors that go into the organization, they are part of a much greater community that impacts the organization. Knowing that my personal information is safe, absolutely, to be able to have the respect of confidentiality, not to be lied to, because it's hurtful. Transparency is really key, and honesty, and to know that your organization is engaging with you from an honest perspective. to feel like you can be part of a solution. A big part of trauma-informed organizations is team decision-making that involves everyone in making solutions. Knowing there is not some hidden bias perception about people in your situation. These are wonderful. Being valued, believing the organization has your best interests at heart and will work with you and for you. Yep. That was a lot of responses. So we all know what this would feel like. Wouldn't it feel absolutely wonderful to be part of an organization that can do this, not feeling like you have to walk on eggshells, being your true self and being accepted for your true self. A general accountability that we know what's expected of us and what we can expect of others makes for very smooth running organizations.
Susan, do you want me to change the slide, or did you want to talk about institutional courage and things like that here?
You can go ahead if you want to talk about this.
I didn't know if you were.
I didn't, but you
can. Me to change? A lot of this, everything that everybody's talking about, really takes what's being coined as institutional courage, the courage to identify and figure out and step up and say, how can we do things differently? How can we be aware of how we got here, what's the past, what's important about the past for different people, why is it important, what of the past can we let go, what of the past can we move forward. It's all this whole aspect of, to really make a change, to be aligning with all of the characteristics you all are describing so beautifully of how it would feel. It takes a tremendous amount of organizational courage to stop and reevaluate, to stop reacting and pause and start thinking about what can we do differently in awareness of principles of trauma.
So really, I think what we're looking for, and what you have certainly identified, is this notion of organizational justice, right? Where the members' sense of the moral propriety of how they are treated is that glue, right? That holds, that allows people to work together effectively. All of those things that you just mentioned are that glue that can hold an organization together. Injustice is more like a corrosive solvent, right? That can actually breaks these bonds of relationship. So if we can trust in our organizations to know that they've got our backs, that we are free to be really who we are and how to interact with one another, and we really understand that when someone comes before us for treatment or even as a peer, they bring their whole life experience along with them, and that we can acknowledge that, and that's what can enhance trust.
Okay, so to really expand upon this idea that Susan just talked about of organizational trust and letting go, we want to recognize that it is a process, and it's a process that ideally is going to promote, well, not just, it should promote space for more positive interactions among everyone in the organization at all levels: clients, staff, organization leadership, and then which then expands out to the entire system, the entire organization. And so instead of being reactive and trying to slap a solution on the problem with an event or one meeting, and then wiping our hands of it and saying, all right, let's go move forward. It must be built over time with scaffolding, starting smaller and working your way up. And so you want to create a foundation that allows for mistakes and responding to mistakes. You know, an organization is made up of human beings who are going to make mistakes, as human beings do. Supporting earlier identification of the system's dilemmas to intervene sooner. So building on the ability to be proactive rather than reactive. putting problems in perspective, and not allowing an individual or systems to be characterized by the problem. The problem is not the organization, it's something that is occurring within it. What is a win? And so I think a lot of times, again, with kind of putting, trying to put a one-time event or solution in place to try to change things or make things better, and that, because that feels big and like it's a big thing, that's the win. But actually the wins can be really start out small, and some of those small wins can be honestly sometimes the most impactful. And so how can things shift in terms of expectations of what that looks like, and how can we recognize those wins, whether it's just an interaction between two people or a large scale program. And that really no problem related to trauma can be resolved in one meeting. I keep coming back to that theme. Trauma, it's so complex. And as we already identified, we have all the individuals involved, their own individual stories and histories, experiences. We then have the small groups that are kind of their own organization. And then we have leadership and the whole larger organization. And so just even that is complex. And then all of those levels are interacting. So how can there be this recognition that it is complex, but also figuring out what can be changed today, just for today? What is one small thing that can start the change process and then can be built upon in a consistent way?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Elisa. Because as we move into thinking about what are we going to do next? This piece of letting go, there's this whole discussion about forgiveness. And you know what? It's more about thinking about letting go and situating things that have happened in the past in a space of all the different concepts that Elisa just talked about, and agreeing to move forward, and that we see and understand what happened. We see and we hear and we honor what has happened to you at an individual level, at a group level. We hear each other differently. We are realizing that trauma has happened in a number of different ways and a number of different places, and that everybody is in a space of exhaustion, burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary traumatic stress. And when we realize that that trauma has happened and that trauma is happening, and that the aspects and characteristics of trauma are what it's that from holding us back, from letting go, from gaining trust, and from moving forward, then we're truly starting to recognize the permeating impact of trauma. And at an organizational level, we can think about how can we start letting go and moving forward. And so we have some thoughts that will help us through the rest of the talk that are approach principles. I often get asked about, oh, you're going to do that trauma-informed thing. And I think our whole group, all of these principles fall under the major premise that trauma-informed care isn't about we have the recipe for the just right decision, and this is exactly what the decision is. That aligns with the concept of a single story. And it's not a discrete theory of, we can exercise this out, right? This is a way of being. Trauma-informed thinking is a way of being that takes time, right? And time takes time. And so it's a paradigm shift for all of us to start thinking about how can we apply these principles in all of our activities at the individual, group, organizational level, and cross organizations, right? And so we had the SAMHSA's 6 guiding principles for trauma-informed care. The first is safety. This is ensuring that in all of our actions, we are prioritizing physical, emotional, and spiritual safety, that we are aiming for trustworthiness and transparency, that everyone is seeing and hearing and being seen and heard, and we know why decisions are made and we know what's happening. That there's empowerment of voice and choice, that across the tiers that we're talking about, from Dakota up to the COO and CFO of the hospital, of the organization, that everybody's voice has relevancy, needs to be honored, and that there are choices along the continuum for everybody. Peer support, an acknowledgement of everything that people have been through in their historical lives as individuals, as small groups, as organizations. It is vital that there are spaces to just feel safe, to talk openly and honestly, and not have to have somebody leading, what are we going to do about it? The idea of peer support is we are sharing, we are hearing, we are validating, we are normalizing, but it's not directionally led towards a solution. Peer support is about hearing and validating, being seen, being heard, and gathering a degree of regulation and safety and connection that you are not alone. Mutuality and collaboration. How are we working together? How are we setting up our infrastructure so that there are structures and processes for people to be able to work together? And assuring historical attunement to gender, to race, to culture, to ability, to economic status, to education, and so much more. Originally, SAMHSA had just a few things under here, but we realize it's really expansive to attunement to everything that any individual or any group bring into an experience, especially the experiences and historical experiences that are aligned with oppression, a history of marginalization that has to be considered and honored. When we think about then how are we, at an organizational level, how do you take this? What do you do? We have to combine all different theories of approach, everything from SAMHSA and the Surgeon General to Bruce Perry and others who are out there trying to guide us all, Bessel van der Kolk. So, prioritization at organizational level, we can't forget Maslow's basic level of needs across the organization with a commitment to meet each of those levels. To prioritize regulation. When you have individuals and groups and an organization that are working where some are fight, some are flight, some are freeze, some heart rates are up, some heart rates are down, we have to try to find ways to get everybody regulated, feeling safe, operating in their best neurobiological state and their best infrastructure state as small groups when that all comes together. Prioritizing healthy, safe, connected relationships. How are we assuring that we are seeing people, valuing them, assuring that they matter, and seeking new ways for connections and relationships that are a part of post-traumatic growth? Without assuring Maslow level needs are met, without assuring regulation, without assuring that people feel safely embedded and a sense of belonging and a sense of worth, self-worth and worth to a group, no problem solving, no reasoning, no solution that comes to the table is going to permeate and make a change that will stabilize and stick. We have to have sustainable change. We have to address all the other tiers. And so then we have to start thinking, what's a model? How are we going to do this? How are we going to create a model for shared goals and planning and implementation and having an ongoing evaluation process? It's a really great question. And the Surgeon General actually recently came out with a model that allows for shared goals and planning and implementation that can cross over all tiers. So they talk about the 5 essential workplaces for mental health and well-being. When we go back to the 3-2-1 chat and everything that you all put out there, ultimately it's a reflection of healthy mental and positive mental health and well-being for individuals, for groups, for the organization at large. So it talks about having an aspect of protection for harm, which includes aspects of safety, which is one of the SAMHSA principles, and security, which is one of the Maslow principles. Connection and community, where there's a sense of social support and a sense of belonging. Work-life harmony, where there is autonomy, which aligns with this idea of choices and empowering choices, and flexibility, which is reasoning and processing that can only occur in the function of everybody feeling stable. Mattering at work, that seen, heard, value that you talked about in the chat, that also aligns with mutuality and collaboration, that aligns with aspects of peer support, and then there's growth opportunities for growth. And that really is that hierarchy. You know, when we get all these other things, then we stabilize and situate ourselves in a space that we can grow, we can go beyond, we can recognize the historical things that have come along, we can put in place all of these things, and we can be ready to learn from our mistakes, to accept that mistakes happen, to create a platform and an organization in which we can say, you know what, now we know mistakes happen, and now it is safe to make those mistakes. That's what we've learned, and we're going to move forward with that mentality. We can create new infrastructure, we can create new programming, we can refine. So it's a really, really interesting model that we encourage folks start to consider in the way they move forward with information that we've discussed here today.
Amy, if you could go ahead to the next slide, I think it has one. Thank you so much. We want to jump back to this process of going through the individual, group, and organizational levels to talk about what do trauma-informed responses look like to build trust among individuals, groups, and ultimately organizations. And so we think about just engaging with one another, starting there. And so an organization, group, prioritizing, well, as we mentioned before, regulation and relationship and connection. So starting from a person being, becoming a part of the organization, group, or system, and moving from there. There's also, we want to be aware of individuals' variation and variable ways of regulating emotion, and also being aware of our biases in terms of, well, this is how I can regulate in this way, or, not putting that on others, and respecting our individuality in terms of how we regulate. Simple, small things like we talked about before, starting small and building upon that, and just making a consistent small step to start out with, something like making sure everyone has a name tag, making sure, you're using someone's, their name, their preferred name, what are their pronouns, if they would like to share those. People move at their own pace. And so just, again, going back to the recognition of individual variation in terms of what they are wanting to share or how they want to engage in an organization. Also, that the variation of our individuality is that, we all have different ideas of what safe feels like. And that could be physical safety, emotional safety, all those different levels. And again, this is just, recognizing that. And so when we talk about trust and safety together, how are we all a part of that conversation at an organizational level to make sure that everyone's voice is heard in terms of what feels safe and how we can build upon increasing safety. Drawing awareness to the trigger for the client. Recognizing that, this was a particular trigger, if we think about our story, there was a trigger and it kind of ended up with a variety of different responses from not just the client, but the family members of the client. And trauma-informed de-escalation prior to one size fits all solutions. So again, in the case of our story, the one size fits all solution was we're going to just call security because that's what we do when there's quote unquote an agitated behavior being shown by a patient or a client. And, what does de-escalation look like for that person? Was that really necessary step in that moment to de-escalate in a trauma-informed way? And then, last on this slide, but these are just some examples. It's certainly not covering everything, but that we are honoring our commitments. So that, I think, that goes along with, reliability, transparency. That's so important in being in that trauma-informed mindset. You're keeping your word, but also creating boundaries so that you can keep your word, and being aware that we have our boundaries and we say what those are. And that also models for others that it's safe to share their boundaries and what those are so that we can recognize and move forward.
Thank you, Elisa.
Sure.
In our scenario, we had multiple small groups. We had the family, we had the staff, we had the ultimate leadership response. We have to start thinking about, so within small groups and across small groups, what can we do? And it does start with people individually and collectively being willing to commit to or committing to and reminding one another within a group format that we are committing to being willing to listen, to hear, to see the history beyond the experience. So an example of how to do that might be having a safe space for somebody to drop in a survey about what's happening for them or what they think might be historical aspects that are contributing to a situation that the group can talk through. It requires everybody to commit to not needing to be right. When we operate from fear, shame, self-doubt, the things that trauma brings us to react from, there becomes this space of we need to be right. We need to get the solution now. We need to be reactive and we need to be right. And that needs to change. And so groups holding one another accountable for listening and not trying to win, but rather trying to come and identify things that collectively they can agree on. And those are the things they can move forward on while they work on the things that they're struggling to come to agreement on. Focusing on what they share versus what tears them apart aligns with what I just said. And so an example of how to do this might be in a group meeting, literally doing some brainstorming on a Google Jamboard about what are we here to do, and then everybody throwing up stickies and then saying, okay, there's some common things we agree on. Let's pull these over into a common pot, and then let's now prioritize as a group. What are we going to address? How can we focus on this? In formal and informal groups, just starting to think about how can we make sure that the meeting structure and the meeting environment meets the safety needs of the individuals and group within it. And that requires taking time to understand, what is it that a group of nurses need to feel safe? What is it that a group of social workers need to feel heard and valued? What is it that the patient care service team needs? Because each group is going to have its own definition of safety and value. And it's important that they are seen as unique and individual, as well as what happens across the groups, as an overarching. And so thinking about in meetings, how do we start meetings in a way that assures safety? Jumping down to environment is one way that we can look at this. What is the environment like just coming into a space that's meeting? What is the lighting? Is there green space or, plants and things? Are there snacks and hydration? This is really important across all organizations. It's always been important in healthcare because healthcare service providers are, they rarely go to the bathroom and they rarely eat. And so we have to remember that those basic Maslow needs. So meetings should have snacks and hydration and sensory equipment so that people can get their neurobiological needs met, so that they can be more regulated, so that they can be more ready to participate in the group. And then thinking about artwork, things that can be calm and engaging, aesthetically addressing and avoiding the potential triggering response that can happen. Thinking about artwork, especially for things like metal detectors. Metal detectors are a part of what creates a degree of safety for some people, but the presence of metal detectors creates a degree of lack of safety for other people. So how can we consider the environment and modify the environment through art and other aesthetically interior design efforts to create a presence of safety for everybody, even in light of having a metal detector present. One of the other pieces is committing to strength-based language. People like to linger in their mistakes or pointing out the mistakes of others, lingering in their mistakes as a group, or pointing out the mistakes of another group, as much as we also point out the character flaws of ourselves, of groups, of each other. That's not aligned with trauma-informed thinking, right? So how can we start moving to an expectations of strength-based language amongst our groups? And then when we think about people and environment, we're interacting to engage in occupations and tasks. What needs to be done? How does it need to get done? How are we not operating in silos of groups? How are we not one group over here who's the trauma-informed group and another group over here who's some other group? How are we not nursing, nursing and social work? But when is the all staff floor unit meeting where everybody's represented? And how is that done? And who leads it? And what is the agenda? And what tasks need to get done? And how does the meeting start? How do we create a degree of bringing everybody regulation-wise to the same page and finding common grounds where people can find things that they share? It's super important. Even as a silly example that I often do a lot in a space of new people, I'll say, would you rather go to the beach or the mountains? And would you like to go alone or with somebody else? You could be in a group of people where there's adversarial relationships and people come in with heightened, ready to fight or afraid or fawning behaviors. And suddenly people who were adversaries you go to the beach and you go by yourself. Me too. My gosh, we have something in common. Like it comes down to starting group connections by finding something in common. Environmentally, circles. And then even thinking about having restoration circles as part of a proactive process for groups to be able to start restoring and healing and creating a sense of community and a sense of belonging through restoration circles. And then just circles in general, how are all of our meeting spaces set up? Are we sitting and facing around each other? So these are just some initial strategies. There's so many more things that could be done, and it might seem simplistic. It's a start. Oftentimes we have to back up and start simple and keep it simple in order to build success and chain sustainable successes over time that people start to feel safe and trust that it can happen.
So now expanding back out to the organizational level, for some examples, some strategies to respond in trauma-informed ways. Space, I think, is a big theme, as you can see. So creating physical and figurative space for conversation and dialogue to continue to build on this idea of trust. Bringing all groups together, we talked about that already. Expectations to be proactive, to promote safety, transparency, assure and ensure that all staff can contribute to support resolution. So are we asking all levels of individuals at the organization for ideas and for support. Providing stakeholder feedback opportunities, clients, staff, funders, whoever's a stakeholder in that organization. Recognizing that there are embedded power dynamics and continuums, and being open to explore those dynamics. And just number one, recognizing them aloud, because the dynamics are at play all the time. It's just maybe sometimes not as overtly discussed. And so recognizing when it's playing a role in decision making, and when and if wherever possible, trying to break down the hierarchy and creating more equitable decision making. And again, that's just building on all of these trauma-informed principles that we've discussed already.
So what are the outcomes of a trauma-informed organization? Absolutely greater staff satisfaction. When you feel comfortable at work and you can be yourself and you can get along with your peers, and we know that we're serving clients the best that we can when we feel supported, there's much greater satisfaction. Of course, when we're feeling more satisfied, there's less staff turnover. So we have greater consistency in our teams, in our organizations, so that we can even develop stronger bonds with those that we work with in how we help and assist with clients and manage with leadership. I must say there's often been an improved responsiveness to difficult situations. There was an organization that I worked with for a while that we worked from this perspective, and when a difficult situation arose, staff immediately responded. And when one of our staff left to go to another organization and a very similar situation happened, nobody responded. And she had sort of expected, like, every organization does this, and it's not necessarily the case. I've also observed there's this opportunity for improved creativity when it comes to not only generating better solutions for better participant and client outcomes, but also in the kind of programming that people will do. When people feel really supported and they feel part of the organization, they really can thrive. So we can develop even more creative kinds of interventions. And certainly over the long haul, we are looking at greater program success. Success means that we can even get eligible for greater funding to do even more. So it really feeds on itself in a really, really positive way.
So we hope amongst the story and the aligning the story with understanding how trauma evolves to disrupt trust, and how we can use trauma-informed thinking at the different tiers to start thinking about how can we respond, that we've given you all some thoughts and ideas. And we really appreciate you all coming on a beautiful, here in Philadelphia, it's a sunny afternoon, Friday. So investing, being curious and wanting to learn more. We're really grateful for your intentful attention here today. So we are certainly open to any questions, discussions. How is this falling for you?
There are two questions that are here from what are called anonymous attendees here, stating, what if you get pushback regarding transparency? A good question.
I always think when I think about when anybody's giving pushback about anything, transparency, peer support, trust, I begin to think about why. Where is that person coming from? What is their experience? What is their history? What event is happening? What is it? What is the fear or the anxiety? often there's patterns of how I need to respond. And if there's got to be transparency, somebody might uncover that I'm not doing things the right way, or that, there's all different layers of individualized, like, why don't I want people to know? Maybe I'm hiding some, consciously or unconsciously, there's some things or some in my past that I've created patterns of responses on that I'm aware of or not aware of, but if they become uncovered, I might be incredibly uncomfortable. That's kind of the first place I go with that, is why or what's happening that people are fearing transparency. What do they think might happen? Anyone else in the panel want to?
And I think there are some things that organizations haven't been that transparent about. Budgets have always been very secretive, and why we have rules and policy and procedure manuals are kind of these hidden documents that we don't want to share with others. So I think some of it is even historical, but when we really start to open that up and we can show our budgets, we don't need to show everybody's salary, certainly, but we can certainly show where the money goes within our organizations, and there's nothing that secretive about that, and that folks can actually learn from that. And when we start to break down what our rules are, it gets us to really take a look at, like, why do we have these rules that we have? Do they actually make sense? So yeah.
And then also, just in terms of, if you're in a level at the organization where you may not feel safe to go to that person to say, why can't we be transparent? I think about gathering feedback, or, getting a feel for others in your group, and, at your level, and saying, we have a lot of concerns, maybe, having the power of the group behind you to present, in a way that can say, these are our concerns, and we're just unsure of where this information is coming from. And so if we had a better idea, and showing that it's like, we want to work to help build solutions to it too, and not just identify the issue. And I think that can come across a little bit, I don't know, could come across a little bit better in terms of the request for transparency.
Yeah. There's another question. It says, regulation seems to be very contentious. How is a young manager supposed to get city government and CEOs to understand that regulations actually benefit smaller agencies? The first take on that is that we want to make sure we're defining regulation from a trauma perspective. When we think about city and governing bodies and laws and regulations that are to guide actions and interactions, that's different from what we're referring to, which is regulation, which is a state of being. So are we calm? Are we able to be clear-minded at an individual level? It's, are your thoughts calm? Is your heart rate in a good spot? Where's your blood pressure? That brain state of being regulated in the lower brain, so that you can move on to be more engaged in an information processing and relational way. Does somebody want to take the next question?
So our next one is, what do you think about including employee or customer surveys and integrating continuous feedback in an organization? Do you think that swapping rewards, I'm assuming that's for these surveys, is ethical? I would say that feedback's really important. That's going to be part of that transparency thing, and we're getting to know about what the experiences of the employees in the organization. We're going to know about what the experiences of the people who interface with that organization. And we can't know if we're meeting our goals or objectives if we don't have that feedback. So that's the first part. That second part, what was it? Popping back over. Swapping rewards for these surveys is ethical. maybe that depends on how everything is put together, right? Like, are we doing it for authentic engagement, or is it easy for somebody just be like, I'm going to falsify some things or do things a little bit differently so I can get that reward? So that would be my response, is it kind of depends on how it's put together and how it is that we're getting the information and collecting the information from the people completing the surveys.
From running an organization, that kind of feedback is absolutely necessary from staff and of course from all program participants. And I will confess that I have given pizza out for those who will complete surveys. So I think, like you mentioned, in some settings that's kind of okay, because you really want to get as much information as possible. So,
Well, and I think that ties back into just making sure that basic needs are met.
yep.
Right. If I have a warm belly and I'm feeling regulated and I'm feeling connected, that somebody cares enough to make sure that I've slowed down and been fed, I'm going to be able to do better reasoning. And you know what? I might not be as snippy in my responses. There's a higher potential of getting more honest responses of how people are really feeling in the surveys when all of their needs, many of their needs are being met.
Well, and to go beyond that, whoever is responsible in the organization or the organization as a whole, like, make sure that you're showing that you're receiving that feedback and you're acting on it. And it's not just like we're collecting it because it's a box to check in the policy and procedures manual, but we're collecting it, we're interpreting it, we're making changes and informing what we do from what people said.
Absolutely. Not only are we asking for information, but we see and hear and value the information that you provided to us. And we're going to be transparent about all the information that came in and what we're going to do with it.
Yeah, and when you do it on a regular basis, it just becomes part of what you do. So it doesn't make people kind of skeptical about, why are you asking for this kind of information? It just becomes part of your process.
There's another question about what happens when there are no rules or policies in an organization, and that is purposeful in the organization order or to make up. And they're saying, do you think that's a red flag? So I think ultimately what this attendee is asking about is, when there are no guiding norms by which we do business, and that's a purposeful decision to have no guiding norms, is that a problem? And yes, that is, right? Because then the rules are constantly changing. People are operating from a space of lack of predictability, lack of understanding what the roles and the expectations are, as well as, no matter how I perform, what's the outcome going to be? And it doesn't give groups a normative space to work from.
And structure
It's a definite red flag. Sorry.
Yeah, structure provides us with a sense of safety and security. We need to know what's expected, and our participants all need to know what's expected. Yeah.
I think that also can ensure equity, and so that everyone's aware that these are for example, for staff, these are the criteria by which all are being evaluated, or expectations of all, so that if there are potential issues, it can be clear if it falls within that or not, or if someone raises an issue about, I don't feel like I'm being evaluated in the same way.
I want to be sensitive to the time. Are there any other questions or comments that anybody would like to ponder together?
It looks like we got something about the swapping rewards for feedback. Their experience was a central organization giving clients who were in desperate need rewards of points for groceries. I've seen that other organizations didn't make the feedback contingent on those surveys, and instead gave out free grocery cards to those in need. Yeah, and I that's interesting. It's kind of that, like, if you do that, like, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But that does not really sound like a trauma-informed way of going about it.
I think it also depends on who you're surveying, right? So no, absolutely not. If we're looking for customers' feedback, we're not going to only give the food to the feedback of the, our end clients. That's not equitable. It's not safe. It's not promoting that aspect of that you matter and you care. And we were talking about like, here's food. Can you, here's pizza. Can you do the survey? Not you only get the pizza after you do the survey. So
Right.
I think that, you get food only after you do something that actually goes completely against Maslow, right? That is restricting a basic need until you perform a certain way. And then when you perform a certain way, we will assure that your need is met. And that like walks in the face of even the start of Maslow.
Looks like we have one last question. Do you think the advice you mentioned here can be used by established large organizations and also small organizations? I would absolutely say yes. A lot harder in a large organization. There's a lot of moving parts, but absolutely can be used in either side of either size of an organization. So.
Yeah.
So Amy, as we get to the bottom of the hour, let me go ahead and chime in here. I apologize. I wasn't able to be on for the start of today's session, but I want to congratulate you and Anne and Alyssa and Susan on another great presentation. I think as many people within the CPH community know, this idea of trauma-informed care, trauma-informed thinking has becoming increasingly talked about within our community. That we are seeing more scholarship in that area. We're seeing more consideration of those issues. I just want to congratulate you and the team for really, getting us to start thinking about these issues, even in the before times, before the pandemic. And I think that to see this group continue to blossom, get together as part of the Friday seminar series a couple times a year, I think is great and wonderful. I know I take great pride in being able to support you guys and give you this forum, and thrilled to see the number of people that we had on board today. And want to continue to see that you do this great work and think that, as we keep our eye on 2025 and our new building, I think this is going to be a fundamental part of how we think about so much of what we do. So congratulations to all of you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending.